The very first Thanksgiving Day. The Very First Thanksgiving Day by Rhonda Gowler Greene, paintings by Susan Gaber. So that means we call Rhonda Gowler Greene the author of this book because she wrote the words for the book. We call Susan Gaber the illustrator because she used paint to paint the pictures that are in this book. Here's the first title page in the book. The Very First Thanksgiving Day by Rhonda Gowler Greene, paintings by Susan Gaber. Can you look at this picture and tell what's going on? This book is very interesting because it doesn't go in straight order. It starts at the end and goes backwards to the beginning, and then when it gets to the beginning of the story, it starts telling the story again. So really, the middle of this book is the beginning of this book. Let's find the middle of this book that really is the beginning of this book. Have you heard anything about the things you're seeing in the pictures as I turn the page? Have you learned the story that you're seeing pictures for yet? This is the page that is really beginning the story. The first part of the book goes backwards from the first Thanksgiving Day back to when the Pilgrims left England. This is the day that the Pilgrims left England. Then, from this page on, it tells the same story again in Ford's order, with slightly different pictures and new details that it didn't mention in the first half of the book. When we get to this page, you'll know that we've gone backwards to the beginning of the story, and it will start retelling the same story that we heard in the beginning of this book. Also listen, because you'll hear many rhyming words. This story has beautiful text, and most of the words in the story have a rhyming word. This is the very first Thanksgiving Day. Really, that's where our story ends. But in this book, it's also where our story begins. Have you heard about the very first Thanksgiving Day? Do you see the pilgrims setting up benches and tables made of wood to celebrate a feast? Do you see their crops that they've recently harvested and can continue to harvest for a little while longer? This is the Pilgrim Village at Plymouth in the state of Massachusetts. This is the food gathered and blessed, the corn and sweet berries the wild turkey dressed, shared on the very first Thanksgiving Day. So you can see the corn and the wild turkey and the other foods, and you can see many pilgrims preparing this food. And this is food that they learned how to grow and how to make from their neighbors, the Native American Wampanoag people that lived near them. These are the Indians, skillful and strong, who knew how to live through the winters so long, and ate of the food gathered and blessed. Here is a picture of a Wampanoag tribe members, probably Chief Massasoit, maybe Squanto and Samoset, who had taught the Pilgrims many things about how to survive in the land of Massachusetts at Plymouth Rock, where they had landed. One of the many things the Wampanoag taught the Pilgrims is how to grow corn called maize. And on every page it's talking about gathered and blessed. Gathered is when they took it out of the fields and brought it in to get ready to eat. What do you think they mean blessed? They're saying that the food is blessed because God blessed the pilgrims to live through the first hard winter and to meet the Wampanoag. And so the pilgrims blessed the food, thanking God for the food that they had to eat. These are the pilgrims who farmed the new land, who steadfastly labored and toiled by hand and learned from the Indians, skillful and strong. So here's Squanto. Squanto was actually from a different tribe, but now he lived with the Wampanoag people, and Squanto spoke English, and he taught the pilgrims many things about how to survive in this new land. One of the things he taught them was how to plant corn and beans and squash in a small mound, and how to put a herring fish under the ground in the mound with it, and it would help the plants to grow. And these are all the pilgrims who were steadfast, who labored long hours to learn from the pilgrims and to learn to grow things and hunt and gather things to help them survive. These are the houses built in straight rows that stood in the hot sun and harsh winter snows, sheltered the pilgrims who farmed the new land. So after they had learned how to live and how to survive from the Wampanoag people, they had cut down trees to build these strong houses, and they built them in straight rows to make a city like the ones they had come from in England. And there's their gardens where they planted some vegetables that they brought seeds for from England, and some vegetables that the Wampanoag people taught them how to grow. And these houses were very important because before they had time to build them, they'd gone through one winter without all these houses, and many people had not survived. This is the harbor, marked by a huge stone, where first steps were taken to chart the unknown, not far from the houses built in straight rows. So when the pilgrims first got off their ship, the Mayflower, it was late fall or early winter, and they didn't know anything about the land. All they knew is that they'd come to land in America. They actually thought they were somewhere different than where they really were. They didn't know what the Native Americans would be like or what the land would be like. And so it was unknown. Everything was unknown when they first arrived. This is the Mayflower ship in full sail that weathered the rough seas, the wind and the hail, and docked in the harbor marked by a huge stone. So there is the Mayflower, a huge sailing ship that brought more than 100 people over from England, and they had to be on that ship for over 2 months without getting off, because when they were in the Atlantic Ocean crossing from England to America, there was nowhere to stop and get off. So they'd been on there going to the bathroom, sleeping, eating, everything they were doing on this boat for 2 months. And they finally landed, and there's a Wampanoag man who saw them land, but he didn't know what they wanted, and he didn't know who they were or what they were there to do. This is the ocean that never would end, that sometimes was foe and sometimes was friend, that carried the Mayflower ship in full sail. The pilgrims crossed the Atlantic Ocean from England, in Europe, across the Atlantic Ocean to America. And they were looking for freedom from the king who would not let them worship God the way that they wanted to. It was a very long trip, and a lot of pilgrims got sick. This is the land where it all began, the land where a brave group made ready their plan to travel the ocean that never would end, that sometimes was foe and sometimes was friend. So here are all the pilgrims when they were still in their land where they were from, called England, and they were trying to decide if they should get on the ship or not. And there's lots of other ships, but theirs was called the Mayflower. And they finally decided that they wanted to worship God the way they thought was best. And so they decided to get on that boat, even though they didn't know much about where they would go, to find freedom to worship God. Now we're back at the beginning of the story. We started at the end of the story with the first Thanksgiving. And then we learned about things the pilgrims had to do to get ready for that first Thanksgiving. Things they had to learn, things that had to happen before they could thank God for surviving. And now we're back at the beginning of the story. And we're going to tell the story again from the beginning back to the first Thanksgiving. That carried the Mayflower ship in full sail, that weathered the rough seas, the wind and the hail. What's the name of this boat that brought the pilgrims over? It's the Mayflower. And docked in the harbor, marked by a huge stone, where the first steps were taken to chart that unknown. And that huge stone, they called it Plymouth Rock. Not far from the houses built in straight rows that stood in the hot sun and harsh winter snows, and sheltered the pilgrims who farmed the new land, who steadfastly labored and toiled by hand. There's one of their houses up closer with the garden in the back and the children working to collect cranberries, and the mom and maybe older sister were working to collect water and sticks to do the things they needed to do when they arrived in the new land. And learned from the Indians, skillful and strong, who knew how to live through the winters so long. There's Squanto teaching the pilgrim women and children and some of the men which berries are safe to collect that they can eat from the forest, and which plants are safe to eat, and which ones are safe to touch, and which ones are dangerous. And ate of the food gathered and blessed, the corn and sweet berries, the wild turkey dressed. Here's all those pilgrims and Native Americans standing together. There's their chief, Massasoit. And there's the long table of food they were able to grow thanks to the Wampanoag's help. Shared on the very first Thanksgiving Day. I hope you enjoyed this story, The Very First Thanksgiving Day by Rhonda Gowler Greene, paintings by Susan Gaber. I'm going to go back through the story and just read it this time without talking in between, and let you look at the pictures and think about what this beautiful rhyming text is describing to you. This is the very first Thanksgiving Day. This is the food gathered and blessed, the corn and sweet berries, the wild turkey dressed, shared on the very first Thanksgiving Day. These are the Indians, skillful and strong, who knew how to live through the winters so long, and ate of the food gathered and blessed. These are the pilgrims who farmed the new land, who steadfastly labored and toiled by hand, and learned from the Indians, skillful and strong. These are the houses built in straight rows that stood in the hot sun and the harsh winter snows, and sheltered the pilgrims who farmed the new land. This is the harbor, marked by a huge stone, where first steps were taken to chart the unknown, not far from the houses built in straight rows. This is the Mayflower ship in full sail that weathered the rough seas, the wind and the hail, and docked in the harbor marked by a huge stone. This is the ocean that never would end, that sometimes was foe and sometimes was friend, that carried the Mayflower ship in full sail. This is the land where it all began, the land where a brave group made ready their plan to travel the ocean that never would end, that sometimes was foe and sometimes was friend, that carried the Mayflower ship in full sail, that weathered the rough seas, the wind, and the hail, and docked in the harbor marked by a huge stone where first steps were taken to chart the unknown. Not far from the houses built in straight rows that stood in the hot sun and harsh winter snows, and sheltered the pilgrims who farmed the new land, who steadfastly labored and toiled by hand, and learned from the Indians skillful and strong, who knew how to live through the winters so long, and ate of the food gathered and blessed, the corn and sweet berries the wild turkey dressed, shared on the very first Thanksgiving Day. The Very First Thanksgiving Day by Rhonda Gowler Greene, paintings by Susan Gaber.